Welcome to Spartan Up Podcast. We have Joe DeSena, we have Tim Nye, we have Sephra, Johnny, Marion right there, who you don't get to see, but you should because she's fantastic.
Really?
Speaking of fantastic, we tell a lot of stories here, and we meet a lot of people who tell stories. This is a guy who is actually a master of the art of storytelling. He is going to teach us how to tell stories in such a way that you can completely change your life. Jeff Gomez, you got to see this. Incredible.
By the way, I will say he does it not only for himself and companies like Sony, but he also does it for the Department of Defense. So this is...
We're going to talk about that.
Got it. We're going to talk about it. All right. We are here for Spartan Up Podcast with the infamous Jeff Gomez. We met years ago with Richard Branson. He is the, what do you call yourself, like super storyteller?
Super storyteller. No, I'm a producer with the Producers Guild of America. I'm an accredited producer, and I'm a writer, and I specialize in something called narratology, or the study of story.
Huh. So explain that.
A lot of people think that storytelling, which dates back to early humanity, is some kind of a magical thing. You have this amazing talent, and it comes out, and we are entranced by story. We look at it in movies or read the novels and get caught up in story. But really, story is composed of hundreds of different little tiny components that are put together mostly intuitively and come out beautifully or elegantly, but some are not so good. And we kind of see it as a science.
And where do you tell these stories? Like, do you write comic books? What do you?
It started out for me in kid stuff, kind of Arrested Development. I was a very imaginative little kid. I was living in kind of a hostile little environment. The Lower East Side of New York City in the 60s and 70s was kind of tough. And for me, the escape was dinosaurs and monster movies and fairy tales and mythology. I didn't want to leave that kind of fantasy world, but there was nothing. I kept consuming it so quickly, I'd run out of it real fast. So I started to make up my own stories.
And I remember you told me you lived in Japan for a while, or did you did live in Japan, right?
Well, my mom was a free spirit, and she moved us to Hawaii in the mid-1970s. And Hawaii was dominated by Japanese popular culture. So the cool thing about Japan is that when they make stuff for kids, it's kind of mature. They have, they take kids seriously. The stories are life and death. They're very complicated. They have prequels and sequels and sidequels and all kinds of merchandise around their kid properties. And I just loved that. It was so much more sophisticated than Jabberjaw or Grape Ape or some of the nonsense that was on Saturday morning television in the 70s.
And how old were you when you were in Hawaii? How old was that?
I was 12 years old.
I was 12. So you're consuming this stuff in Hawaii. When do you make the switch to actually producing the stories?
Well, I wanted to go to Japan and make anime and all this cool monster stuff and so forth, but as luck would have it, Mom wanted to go home, so I got stuck in New York and experienced some pretty tough years in the late 70s and early 80s before I started figuring out how to start writing myself and start heading toward a career in writing.
Your dad left, right? I remember you telling me that story.
Yeah.
You feel comfortable talking about that?
Sure.
Yeah. So what happened there?
Dad was my parents were young, like super young when they had me and then got married, and he was a Puerto Rican guy in New York City when Latinos weren't really welcome,
Sure.
and so he grew up to be kind of an angry dude, and I was so different from him. There was always a bit of space between us, and eventually he kind of couldn't deal with New York and left for Puerto Rico. So me and my mom and my kid sister hung out for a little while, and then we ran to Hawaii.
And how does that affect your storytelling? Like that kind of having that happen to you?
As a little kid, stuff like that happens to you. You're in a tough, violent environment. For me, being imaginative, I at first chose to reject all of that. I wanted to be nothing like my father or these people around me. I wanted to kind of hole up and draw my pictures and write my stories myself. But there was always this loneliness that was isolating me, and it was really starting to bug me. There had to be a way to cross that line, to connect with a lot of people somehow. And I noticed that the things that I loved, a lot of people loved. Hollywood movies, cool TV shows and things like that. If somehow I could become involved in that, then maybe I can connect with people. And so that was sort of why I pursued the career I pursued.
And now it's called Transmedia?
Well, the idea of originally the idea was, well, maybe I can make a movie or a TV show or a novel. But because I trained myself with these elaborate kind of story worlds like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis and Narnia, these huge universes, they seemed not to be able to be contained in one media for me. I wanted to be able to do like the Japanese did and create stuff that people could chase from one media to the next, to the next, to the next. You started to see that in the United States with Star Wars, right? There was a movie, and then there were comic books that didn't necessarily repeat the same story as the movie, and there was music and novels and things like that. That was awesome, and I wanted to see if I could design from scratch these story worlds that could roll out across different media platforms, and that would eventually be called transmedia storytelling.
You were one of the first to do that, or?
Well, I was one of the first to practice it as a practical application. In other words, when I worked for a comic book company and I was assigned to create a video game based on a comic book, I said, we could also create a website that holds some of the extra story that I can't fit into the video game, and we can create a little comic especially for the video game, and we can put original information about the characters in the action figure packaging, and suddenly it all came out at once and was a big hit. That was, I don't know if your audience would remember, but there used to be the Nintendo 64 platform in the 90s, and Turok Dinosaur Hunter was a smash hit on that platform, on that game console, and I created the Turok Dinosaur Hunter video game world.
Where has that taken you? I mean, to
there's a big hit. So suddenly I wasn't just a kid imagining these fantasy worlds. I got invited to help put these story worlds together. So I moved on to a trading card game called Magic the Gathering, and I used my understanding of fantasy to tie the cards together in some giant story that took place in comics and video games and novels. And those two successes, Turok and Magic, they were pretty big, and it enabled me to raise some money and form Starlight Runner in 2000.
But you also do, I don't know what we're allowed to talk about, what we're not allowed, but some anything. Stuff like for the government where you're helping create a story like for a country.
Sure.
Explain that a little bit. And
Well, once Starlight Runner got underway, our clients started to rack up. So the Walt Disney Company came to us with Pirates of the Caribbean. The 20th Century Fox came to us with Avatar. And we were helping some incredible talent build these elaborate universes that traversed all these different media. The idea came to me that if I could help these guys reach people across all these different media and turn those people into loyal fans, that's sort of like being loyal to a brand or to becoming active over a certain kind of idea. What do fans do? They activate. They talk about your stuff. They create stuff and put it on the internet based on what they love about your stuff. Could people's behavior be nudged so that they behave better or stand up more lawfully, that is, or stand up to extremist dogma or crime? I began to think about that, and when you put signals out into the world, sometimes the world responds. In this particular case, the Obama administration responded and said, hey, can you use this transmedia storytelling to help us with a problem that's going on in Mexico? And there's all this violence and crime. Can you do something about that? And I said, sure. But just remember, this isn't about propaganda. This is about helping these people tell their true, authentic story, to reach into themselves and understand what was just and right and valued in their culture, and bring that back out of them, because that's what it seemed they'd lost, allowing themselves to be subsumed by this crime and violence. And we designed a process which we call transmedia population activation that actually works. And we were successful there in Mexico, and then in Colombia, Australia, other countries around the world as well.
Wow. And then you do some big hit movie. Well, you mentioned Avatar and stuff. So explain that. So a movie studio will come to you and say, "Hey, help us figure out." I remember you saying to me, like, "Should Spider-Man have a girlfriend?" Or
right. Sure. Well, in this day and age, you're investing so much money, if you're a studio, into these movie properties. They kind of have to succeed as video games and comic books and novels and things like that. They also have to succeed in terms of prolonging the public's interest in these properties, sequels, or these whole universes, like what we're seeing with the Marvel Cinematic Universe or Star Wars. Disney does this really well. How do you do that? How do you make these worlds last instead of just these one-off movies? Well, we can go in and break apart these characters and these storylines and show our client exactly what's so interesting and intriguing and engaging about these characters. So it's not just that Spider-Man is a cool superhero. It's actually that he's kind of an ordinary guy. And there aren't that many superheroes who are, schmoes from Forest Hills, Queens. And we have to remind these studios sometimes to remember what's important about the foundational aspects of these characters.
How do we apply this to our own? We got Jesse here who's living like a monk. How do we use this to tell our story as individuals? Because part of Spartan Up, the point here is, right, to help people get motivated, help people be more successful moms, monks, business people.
Absolutely.
How do you better tell your story?
I'm a big proponent of the Spartan philosophy, because so much of it has to do with confronting one's own limitations. It has a lot to do with kind of understanding, from my perspective, that you're living a story. You're kind of the screenwriter of your own movie, you know, and for most people that's fine, but for some people who have problems or challenges that are repetitive, they make the same mistakes over and over again, or something's not satisfying about their lives and how their relationships or how they're realizing their goals and maybe not making it. A lot of that is rooted in how the story started. You know, those first few years are critical because think about it. Your reality is shaped by your parents' reality or your environment's reality, and quite often those are the impositions of a lot of limitations. You know, what's brilliant about writing the story of your own life is you're capable of doing a rewrite and going back and figuring out exactly where you kind of met with these problems initially, and figuring out how you can kind of tell the story in a different way. Because why should I live according to the way that the 5-year-old version of me was handling life? You know, I want to go back and kind of rewrite that experience. It's not my fault, whatever happened to me. And I know better now, so we can start to break old habits and break out of the limitations that were imposed on us.
I hope you're not sitting still while you listen. If you are, you better get a burpee break in.
Next week, Earl and I, we're on it.
We're on it.
Yeah.
We're on it with Aubrey Marcus.
Aubrey Marcus.
All right, the young man from University of Richmond, philosophy major.
Yep, brilliant philosophy.
Transformed himself into a fitness guru.
Yep.
Who now has an entire fitness enterprise, if you will, right?
Yep, he's got his own podcast and some pretty cool looking kettlebells. And yeah.
Well, he's got supplements. He's got athletic gear. He's gone from the classroom to the boardroom overnight, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I tell you, fascinating story. So where can everybody
if you
hear
don't
it
want to
or
miss
see
an
it?
episode, subscribe on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you watch. We'll be there.
What exercise do you recommend? I mean, Jesse's going through it now. He's living in a monastery, right?
Sure.
You're rewriting your story, really.
Yeah.
That's what you're doing.
I love that line that you said about rewriting. You know, you write your own screenplay.
Because if you, I'm sorry to interrupt,
Sure,
but if
sure.
you're right. If you are convinced that somebody else is writing yours, well, then you're stuck. But he's
100%.
saying no. You write it yourself.
You write it yourself.
Go back and erase a
No
page.
matter what happened to you.
Just going to chime in one
Sure,
thing before
sure.
I leave. One thing that I do, and I don't know if this is a technique, but I'll go to the end of the movie in my head. So let's say I'm starting a business. I'll see it already sold. It's already sold. I've made $1 million. I'm making it up.
Sure.
I got to fill in the script now how I get there, but the end is already done. I'm going to finish the marathon. I'm going to wear the medal. Now I just got to fill in the training. But the script is always kind of written. Is that sort of...
In a way, certainly. We go backwards instead of forwards because for a lot of the brands and storylines that we're working with, if you go forward and don't make the adjustment in the past, the past is still a rudder that is guiding how you're going to get to realize that goal. And sometimes it's not the most productive way. Or sometimes you'll do something that's, dishonorable or not adherent to the best possibility of yourself. So
he might, in his example, he might be carrying a bad habit because of the way he was influenced as a youngster.
Right. So he sets a goal,
right,
and maybe that goal means hurting a lot of people in order to achieve the goal. He achieves the goal,
right,
but his past is radiating this poison or this negativity that is informing how he gets to that goal.
That makes sense. You're gonna have another 48 hours to think about this.
Well, I'll just live with Gomez.
There you go. You should live with Gomez.
Figure it out in 30 days.
That's it.
Appreciate this. Very helpful.
Absolutely.
See you guys.
You're awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Special guest.
Yeah, thank you. See you guys.
So
Okay.
you were just asking how if, were there like some techniques?
Yeah. What are the,
Does that
so
make sense?
what are the techniques that people can use to rewrite their story?
It's funny, Joe, you and I talked about this with regard to Spartan because I wanted to understand Spartan race and where it came from. And one of the things we talked about that we apply to big brands and big movies and even big crises, socio-political crises, is the concept we call primal challenge. And it's really just an exercise that anybody can try. We are born, and we're the bright center of the universe. You know, everything exists to serve us. If it doesn't, we're dead.
Sure.
And if it doesn't, for a short time, we get aggravated. We scream or cry, and something gets stuck in our mouths, or our diapers changed, or something like that. But after a few years of being the bright center of the universe, something happens. We're somehow shown that we're not, and we're snapped out of this bliss that we were in our infancy, and made to realize that the world is kind of rough. You know, it could be a dark place. So for some kids or some characters, that's an early childhood humiliation or a tragedy or a disease, something that imposes itself from outside and throws us out of our innocence. And in great stories, the response to that is to make some kind of vow. I'll never let this thing trick me again. I'll never let myself be called stupid again. I don't want to be perceived of as some kind of weakling or nerd. So I'm going to, and then the answer is usually some form of hypercompensation, right? We start doing things that are a response to these early childhood traumas that set us on the road. We start writing that script. The problem is we continue writing that script based on a primordial response to some kind of failure. And we want to be right about what it is that we're doing. So we keep gathering evidence
to confirm the way we're acting.
The way we're acting.
Got it.
You see that? And that locks us onto one road, and it may not be the right road. There are so many other ways to be.
You got to go back and rewrite.
That's right.
But is there a technique? You can actually do a day, or like what do you suggest somebody does?
It's as simple as for our purposes, as in acknowledging the fact that there isn't a single way to be right, that there are always alternatives, okay, and also, what is it that we're doing? What are we giving to the world? What's our contribution? If we can come up with something for ourselves that is symbolic of what it is that we're here to do on Earth, we can match it on a day-to-day basis against that failure to make sure that we're not locked into some situation that's not going to be productive, that's not going to get us an inch closer to realizing this big goal. You know.
Get that.
For me, for example, if the failure was, you know what, I'm not like all the other people, and that will always make me some kind of outcast or nerd or shy kid. I can't be masculine, I can't be macho, I can't be tough because that's what everybody else is and I don't like it. Ultimately that isolated me as a kid. I had some benefits because I learned how to tell stories, but I was lonely for a long, long time, Joe, and ultimately I realized that if the gift that I have is this strange understanding for how people can connect with stories or messages across all these different media platforms, it really means that I want to connect, and I want all of us to be connected. If we're all connected, we can empathize with each other and maybe stop hitting each other and stop harming each other. That'd be cool. So I matched that against that failure. You know, am I being shy and withdrawn and isolated from the world? I'm not writing my story the right way right now. It needs a rewrite, you know? And yes, that is my default. I'm going to go back there.
You might need outside people, though, to help you, because I would think you don't, whoever you are out there, you don't recognize your own faults, right? Absolutely.
But that takes a little bit of boldness, because sometimes it's not easy to hear a buddy say, Gomez, you're acting like, you know, the shy kid again.
Somebody said to us recently, it's really helpful to have like a personal advisory group, people from different areas of life.
Absolutely.
And I had never heard that. We've done 300 interviews, and I thought, you know what? Companies do it. Why can't an individual do it?
That's right.
Right? I want to do a check-in on myself.
Right. Can we talk about the first time that we met?
Yeah, sure.
Because this illustrates the point.
Yeah.
We were sitting on a beach. Everyone seemed so comfortable, but for me, beaches are not the most comfortable environment. There you were sitting across from us. Your body is like, it seems like it's sculpted out of something.
Steel.
And my wife was there, and I leaned over and I was like, "Oh, look at that jock dude." You know, I defaulted.
Don't listen to that.
Defaulted to that kid, right? And my response, and the way you were talking, you were so brash and bold and stuff like that. And I figured out what you represented, the Spartan thing, and I was like, oh. You know, I would never have a thing to talk about with you in the universe. And you know what? Exactly as you said, her job is to kind of give me a knock out of that modality and into the modality of possibility. So she said, you know, you've been dealing with Spartans for the past 2 years.
Oh, that's right. That's how we connected.
The Halo Spartans.
The Halo Spartans, the video game.
The video game Halo has Spartan characters in it, futuristic Spartans. And I was
I was thinking you were looking at me like an academic.
See?
Yeah.
Both are default modes. And I was like, you know, all right, let's try this. And I forwarded that to you. Yeah. And to my surprise, you were actually receptive, and it started a conversation that led to a friendship that's lasted years.
Yes.
And opened up all kinds of possibilities for both of us with our own businesses and so forth. And that was fantastic.
So bottom line is open mind, take advice from people, find people that are willing and kind enough, I guess, to give you an open critique.
That's right. And take it, and take it seriously. You're not going to break.
And don't be afraid to rewrite your story.
Absolutely.
Right? Rip out 100%. Some pages. Burn the book.
Sometimes.
Right?
Absolutely.
Start over.
Yeah.
You're awesome.
Oh, thank you.
I'm glad we're friends, and I had no idea you didn't see me as like some Ivy League graduate. That's how I saw you.
Oh.
Jeff Gomez, the concept of transmedia. I had no idea what it meant, and now I realize that it's kind of like the holistic surroundings of everything that we currently.
But you, because of your age, have lived with it your entire life. When
really?
When you go to a movie, and you have the movie, and you have the trailers, and there's books, there's comic books,
lunchbox.
There's the lunchbox. There's the Happy Meals with the toys inside, and all of it. But all of that has happened in the last 30 or so years.
Okay.
All since your life. So maybe it's just it's been part of your life your whole life.
Yeah, it's the water that you swim in, like a fish. You don't know there's water there. It's just so ubiquitous,
right?
That like the Smurfs, the whatever.
I love
they're
the Smurfs.
Everywhere, and have actually become part of our fabric. All these stories.
You know how we met them? Marion and I were down at Richard Brance's Island when we did one of our first podcasts.
Long time ago.
Interviewed Richard, and I was swimming. And he was sitting on a neighboring island, and I got to know him. And the first few minutes I had no idea what he was talking about. It was just over my head. I didn't know what but I said, this guy's smart, and I want to hang out with him. And as I got to know him, it dove into everything that we talked about here, which is you got to be able to tell a story. You got to be able to tell it well. And he's playing chess. We're all playing checkers.
Yeah, sure.
And you've got to be able to tell it on multiple platforms, right? Yeah. That's podcast, iTunes, YouTube, the rest of it, right? So you can't just single track anymore, right? You want to hit the widest target, the widest audience, so you've got to use the multiple platforms. Right?
I remember when we were first getting Spartan going, like the metal we gave away didn't necessarily match, and not from a color perspective, but from the feeling wasn't the same as the shirt, wasn't the same as the experience of the race, wasn't the same as to what we were saying on Facebook, etc. Right? So that's what he does. He brings it all together. He helps Sony figure out, I don't know if we talked about it, whether or not Spider-Man needs a girlfriend.
Yeah.
Right? And what the girlfriend should look like. Because he knows how an audience is going to respond.
A lot like the one they picked.
A lot like the one they picked.
And Spartan, you guys used to give out those huge swords at the beginning.
We used to give out swords.
I saw Margaret's. That was awesome. Yeah. I think he says, we're living our own movie. We're the screenwriters of our own legacy.
I like that a lot.
And I think we always talk about how do you create your own legacy? How do you want your story to be told? And so I think he's saying how do you want your story to be told on all of these different platforms? And it's just, once again, we always talk about the holistic approach to things. And he's in an industry where he's taken the holistic approach so that it intervenes in every, I don't think orifice is the right word.
Facet. You're looking for facet.
Thank
you, Jim. Thanks for reaching out and pulling that out. We sometimes reference other interviews we've done, and I never know exactly when they're going to come out. So I don't know if this one you've seen yet or not. But you talk about the importance of storytelling. And Ben Weiss of the soft drink company Bai, we talked about how his ability to tell the story and how he owns that story, and as Tim described it, how it really. There's the military precision of a walkthrough that he does.
Right.
When you can own your story like that, you end up selling a company for $1.7 billion. When on paper, maybe you'd wonder why, but it's because of the compelling nature of that story. And when you think about our own lives and the stories we tell ourselves, if we're not excited about that and we don't own that and we're not swept up by it and driven forward by it, where we just want to spring out of bed every day to tell that story.
And it's got to be consistent.
Yep.
Right?
Does it?
It does,
That's the hard part.
It does.
You were talking about Ben Weiss,
yep.
And so we were talking about the military precision. But Mr. Gomez here, Jeff, same thing, right? My ears perked up in the interview when he started talking about that he worked for the Department of Defense / Department of State. He said defense. I think it's more Department of State. But that is, and he went to great lengths to say not propaganda. He said that a couple times. That is MISO, or MIST, Military Information Support Teams, Military Information
I love MISO
Support Operations, which we used to call PSYOP, Psychological Operations. But they bring teams of military down that are basically marketers, if you will, and they come down, they work with the ambassador. The ambassadors tell them what the problems are in the country, and they put together a multifaceted platforms to help fight that problem across the entire spectrum. So either he's been linked up through that system. He talked about going to Australia and also down in the Colombia stuff. I don't know what he was doing in Australia. Colombia I get, Mexico I get. But anyway, I think there's some connectivity there as well.
Yeah.
I think he's had some training with or he has trained, I should say, probably our PSYOP teams down at Fort Bragg.
I think
so. If he can train them.
Wait.
He can train us. This is a good interview.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure, it's a great interview.
And then, just to pay homage, too, to, the ancient art of storytelling, right? A lot of times in these wilderness skills and survival schools I've helped out at, They always say the most important thing is when you come back in from an experience out on the land, tell your story of the day, right? And when you tell your story of the day, and when you're able to tell that story, you embody it, you remember it, you're able to reflect on it, you learn lessons of it. So just that art of keeping storytelling alive in our culture is so important. And he's also, just to maybe end on this, he's also a super nice guy, because Marion's son, who is just this brilliant, really super creative kid, has been sending him some of his writing, and he's just been really generous with his time and giving some great feedback. So here's a guy who works with the DoD, who works with huge media companies, and also just has a lot of humility and humanity, and works with kiddos. So
go Wilbur.
If you want to go Wilbur and Mackie, we love you. So if you guys want to continue listening to our story across all sorts of media platforms, go to spartan.com/podcast and subscribe on iTunes or YouTube.
This podcast, by the way, was brought to you by
Colonel Knight.
No, not Colonel Knight. Special Ops Survivors. Special Ops Survivors, which is a charity that obviously targets the spouses of fallen special operators.
Awesome to be partners with them.
Thank you for watching another epic story of success. If you like our message, please share Spartan Up with your friends and subscribe on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you catch our show, maybe in the woods. Spartan Up is brought to you by Spartan Race. To find a race near you, visit Spartan.com.